Hello and welcome to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Aaron Stein, and today we have a special sneak preview of the Russia Contingency with Mike Kaufman, where Mike sat down with Rob Lee in a two-part episode, the first of which you can listen to for free, where they reflect on their recent research trip to Ukraine, where they visited the front lines, interviewed Ukrainian soldiers, and met with people all throughout Ukraine to understand the ongoing offensive. To listen to part two, take advantage of our special promo celebrating War on the Rocks' 10-year anniversary by clicking on the link in the show notes and get $10 off an annual membership in celebration of our 10-year anniversary. And if you're listening to this later, head on over to warontherocks.com/membership and sign up.
Welcome back to another episode of the Russia Contingency. I'm sitting here with Rob Lee. We are recording a special episode after recently completing a trip to Ukraine. We had another field study. We were near the front line, both in the south and the eastern part of the country, had a lot of interesting discussions, meetings with those from the Ukrainian military at different levels. Obviously, we won't be discussing or disclosing some of the details and nuances, but we'll be offering our impressions. And then later on, I intend to follow up with our other colleagues, Konrad Muzyka and Franz Stefan Gatti, who are also on the trip with us, to get their impressions. But right now, I think this is likely going to be a multi-part episode where Rob and I share at least what we think was the most interesting and the most salient takeaways from our visit here. And so I think I'd like to begin by talking a bit about the Ukrainian offensive, what we've learned about how it's gone, how it started. And for us, usually we start off with trying to figure out what happened and why, and trying to piece together what's been taking place in the campaign, what's been happening in this war, to get the context and to get the initial history right, and to get, therefore, a much better sense of where the war is going, what is happening, and then eventually get to a conversation about what we could expect based on what we've learned about how it started and what are some of the likely causes or established causality in the events. So let me turn this over to Rob, and we'll just go back and forth, I think, as a conversation between the two of us based on our impression.
So let me give you a summary, I guess, so far. It's about 6 weeks since Ukraine began its counteroffensive. It's a long-awaited counteroffensive. It began around June 4th, June 5th, that time frame. Before that, it was about 3 or 4 weeks, maybe more, of we call it shaping operations, where Ukraine was conducting a variety of strikes to try and shape the conditions for the battlefield to make it best for its counteroffensive when they tried to advance. This may have begun right around when we found about the delivery of Storm Shadow missiles from the UK to Ukraine. I think that was around May 10th or May 11th that was first notified. And during those preceding weeks, Ukraine hit a number of targets deeper past the front lines than they were able to before, including a number of command and control points, logistics points, ammo storage points, and also the Chonghar Bridge down by Crimea. And in particular, a number of Russian generals have been killed. I think it was the chief of staff of the 35th Combined Arms Army. I think it was a deputy commander of the Southern District was also killed. We've been a little out of the loop on some of this while we've been in Ukraine. So they've had some success with those strikes. And clearly, it provided a new capability Ukraine previously lacked. So beginning around the first week of June, Ukraine really began its main counteroffensive. A number of people had initially thought this might have been probing operations or diversionary movements, but it was actually the real counteroffensive. It was an attempt to conduct a rapid breakthrough of Russian lines in multiple areas and to try to exploit that as quickly as possible. And so there's been 3 roughly main axes of advance. One has been around Bakhmut, and the Bakhmut kind of campaign has kind of stretched from May, when Wagner took the city, around May 20th. And right before that, Ukraine began a series of counterattacks. So they took back a number of terrain on the flanks, which was quite important for that withdrawal. And they've since then continued to make progress on both the northern and southern flanks. That also continued around that first week of June when the broader counteroffensive began. And as we speak right now, there's been more progress to the south in Klishchiivka, which is arguably some area where Ukraine has made some of the most gains. The second area was the Velikonovosilka area, somewhat substantial gains in about mid-June, but there hasn't been too much movement since then. There's some news yesterday that Ukraine may have taken another town, but it seemed as though it became somewhat stabilized after that point. And the third one was the Orikhiv axis going south, which most likely was the main effort of this phase based on the units involved. And during this phase, again, Ukraine used a lot of its new modern equipment, NATO equipment they received. A number of these new NATO-trained brigades played a really key role in the beginning. And ultimately, the first phase of this operation was not a success. And that's kind of the conclusion that we've reached after talking to a number of people. That doesn't obviously mean that the offensive has failed. This offensive is still going on. Ukraine still has reserves that have not been committed, but the initial phase was not a success for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we're going to dive a bit into the details here as to why we think that is. I think this offensive, as I've said from the very beginning, is likely to go on not just for weeks, but for months. I think it's going to see this extensive attritional phase with grinding fighting, with incremental gains by Ukrainian forces, and that it's going to require a great deal of artillery ammunition, of adaptation. And as always, it's very difficult to conduct an offensive like this against a well-prepared defense. So let me at least start with some thoughts about the Russian side of the equation. So the challenge the Ukrainian military faces, particularly on the southern front, which is the two axes of advance that we see, one pushing south from Orikhiv and another one from Velika Novosilka. Okay? The Russian military has had ample time to dig in and entrench itself for many, many months. It has dug in at the level of division and combined arms army. The situation in the south is quite different than it is in Bakhmut. Part of the reason why advance of Bakhmut have been much easier is because in Bakhmut, the battlefield has been fluid for much of the past year, and Russian units there have largely been able to dig in maybe at the level of battalions. So the level of defenses, entrenchments, fortifications is very different. Russian forces are defending largely according to doctrine, right? There's an initial set of defenses with some expendable forces. There's an effort at maneuver defense and the ability to counterattack any gains in those initial tree lines. Then there's a main line of defenses on what increasingly looks like was one of the main efforts, which is the push from Orikhiv towards Tokmak and Melitopol. There are three lines of defenses. The Russian military has a lot of regular forces. There's motor rifle units. They have Spetsnaz units and others holding key defensive positions along those lines. They have units deployed with battalions in reserve, and they have a fair amount of artillery. The entrenchments include incredibly dense minefields, anti-tank and anti-personnel, layered upon each other. They include a large amount of anti-tank guided missiles, particularly in the forward lines. A lot of units supporting those lines with Lancet 3s, typically thought of as loitering munitions, although they're sort of piloted one-way drones. A fair amount of artillery, rotary aviation, that is attack helicopters that can take out vehicles at 8+ kilometers range, which is pretty substantial in this battlefield. And they've dug in extensively in terms of cementing fortifications, having bunkers, having tunnels in some parts of the main line. On top of that, the Russian military has continued to adapt. They build out fake trenches. They have mine trenches. They have distance-activated mines, that is, they attempt to lure Ukrainian forces into trenches that have been mined with radioactivated mines and then blow up the mines once forces jump into them. They have parts of trenches that are intentionally empty, attempting to get Ukrainian units into those trenches to then essentially blow them up. So the level of mining, improvised explosive devices, and the adaptation of tactics that you've seen is pretty substantial beyond just routine or doctrinal defense. They also have less traditional approaches. For example, stacking multiple anti-tank mines on top of each other in order to destroy and rip off mine-clearing tanks or vehicles that have essentially rollers that you typically see for breaching that are designed to be able to withstand, let's say, one anti-tank mine or maybe two, but the Russian military is doubling, tripling them up. And these are, of course, also high-value targets. So their survivability in the battlefield tends to be pretty low. Anything that's like a MICLIC, right, a distance mine-clearing vehicle, or a tank with a mine roller is likely to be a primary target. And Russian forces are counterattacking, but in many cases when they counterattack, this is fundamentally a battle of tree line. If Ukrainian forces advance, take a tree line, Russian armor moves out, begins to engage that entire tree line at the range of a couple kilometers. The Ukrainian forces that maybe took that tree line, if they don't have effective anti-tank guided missiles with them for that range, don't have a way of reaching Russian armor. And since much of the fuel behind them might be mined, they'd have a difficult time resupplying and bringing up additional capabilities because a lot of this has to be done on foot. And so it's coming down to a war of infantry mine clearing and infantry attacks backed by artillery, backed by drones. But the conversation, I think, has almost gotten a little too far focused on mines and mines alone, right? There's a lot that's taking place here that's worth talking about besides the issue of Russian fortifications, entrenchments, and mines. Yes, it's incredibly dense. And yes, while it's true that the Russian military is forced to ration artillery fire, and we heard this extensively on the front, that yes, Russian military very clearly has issues with artillery ammo, is conserving it, and is firing it judiciously compared to how they used to employ artillery ammunition. They have a vast arsenal of mines, and they regenerate minefields with fast cam type systems. For example, distance mining. They deploy butterfly type anti-personnel mines at range, and they can deploy them even behind lines or positions Ukrainian forces have taken. But let's turn the conversation a bit from the Russian defense, which seems to be a combination of maneuvered defense and positional defense, with limited counterattacks. There are more Russian units forward on the first line than there were in Kherson, with thick concentration of anti-tank guided missiles. But that being said, it's still a fairly echelon defense. And I'm not sure I believe the story based on what I've heard, that sort of all the Russian units are at the front line and all you have to do is just break through the front line and then the Russian front will crumble. I think that's far too optimistic, and I also just don't see that as being very realistic. I think this is going to be a difficult grinding fight. But let's talk about Ukrainian tactics, and also let's talk about what we think happened at the beginning of this offensive and why. And I'll be frank, this is a difficult conversation. I think it is, because it will reveal, I think, much of what I, Rob, and others have been talking and writing about for the past year. That a lot of this comes down to force employment, comes down to force structure. It's not just about capabilities, it's not just about platforms, and also comes down to force quality and experience. And the initial days of the offensive, I think, really brought that conversation to the fore in ways that are both positive and negative. And so I think that this is the podcast where we're going to get into some of that in the best way that we can.
Let me just double tap a couple things you mentioned about the Russian defenses before I jump on the Ukraine side. So Mike covered the mines quite well. One of the big points is that Russia's using mines in a very effective way. And overall, this is all a response to Kharkiv, right? In Kharkiv in September, Russia underestimated Ukraine's ability to do a counterattack. They did not really entrench. They did not use mines. They did not have multiple lines. Their coordination was terrible. And it was a broader breakdown of Russian command and control. They simply did not expect this was going to happen, even though Russian units at the front line knew they were weak and they were vulnerable. And because Ukraine made such gains, I think basically that Putin, senior Russian officers, after that decided we actually have to prepare for Ukraine to conduct a real counteroffensive. And so what we're seeing now is Russia's reaction to what happened in Kharkiv and an attempt to not be embarrassed the same way they were at that time. And ultimately, they've learned lessons. They've learned lessons, and they're fighting in a competent way. That was always going to be a problem because we knew Ukraine didn't have, all the resources they'd want overcoming defenses. And what we found out is that Russia's leadership, they are defending in a competent manner. They're fighting in a doctrinal way, and also the quality of Russian forces. In many cases, these units, they're not the quality varies, but units are fighting, and they're not just surrendering en masse or fleeing, as I think some people had hoped. One thing I'd add to what Mike was mentioning, so we've seen all these different mines. They're actually using more mines than they would according to Russian doctrine. So that is one way they've differed from that. They learned they need even more mines. And one of the takeaways we're talking to some of the Russian commanders who fought in Kherson was that actually a lot of Kherson was really about mines. I think we underestimated how much of the problems Ukrainian forces ran into in Kherson was that it was because of mines, and also that's probably why Ukraine wasn't able to exploit and kind of make the withdrawal more painful for Russia, which some people expected. Because there's so many mines deployed, it just takes time. And that included Russia using some of these remote mine clearing options. Allegedly, that was one of the last assets they brought across the pontoon bridge. One of these were kind of remote mine laying MRS systems, which they're using heavily in the south. And one of the really big problems is that they are using it to kind of interdict Ukrainian lines of communication. So whatever roads that Ukraine uses to transport between different areas, they'll mine that. And every time Ukrainian forces have to clear those mines, they don't have enough engineers to this, or it creates a number of problems. And they're using, it might mention that the Team 62s, these standard Soviet intake mines, they stack multiple on top of each other. It creates a problem that's deliberately designed to destroy mine rollers. They're also using TM-83, these kind of EFP type mines that strike tanks from the side. If you drive parallel to tree lines, that can also kill tanks. They have all these anti-personnel mines, various different types. Ultimately, this is a really significant problem. But it's not just the mines themselves. It's that all the minefields, they're placed areas where they're under Russian observation and within Russian fires, right? And so anytime Ukraine has to breach a minefield, the Russian forces can observe these areas and they can use artillery, anti-tank guided missiles, attack helicopters, other assets, and that's what creates the problem, right? Because Ukraine can breach minefields. It's when you add all these things at the same time, you have multiple threats at the same time, it becomes really difficult. One of the things that's notable about how Russia's defending the south, we mentioned before, Russia has a very kind of varied force quality. And what we're seeing in the south, they've developed kind of ways of dealing and mitigating some of those kind of weaknesses. So there are some of these Storm Z convict units on the front lines in some cases. They're being used in different ways. There are also mobilized units, some of which are not very effective. And they also have better trained, better equipped motorized rifle units. And they also have naval infantry and Spetsnaz units. And they're using them in an effective way. So naval infantry units, the more elite units, are being used either to counterattack or they're being used as at strong points, the most kind of important parts of the front line. Other parts of the front line that are less important, they'll put the kind of Storm Z units. And then Spetsnaz are also playing an important role counterattacking, employing ATGMs as a kind of lighter force. And so basically, when Ukraine kind of commits to an advance in one direction, Russia can then move its elite units to reinforce its weaker units. And that means, psychologically means it's more likely these poor units will actually fight. And also, of course, they bring additional capabilities. And so they've found a way to kind of mitigate some of those weaknesses. I'll move on from the Russian side. The short answer is there was a hope basically for this offensive that Russia would not be able to defend competently. They might have all these issues we've seen before, but in fact, they've actually defending quite competently. And one of the commanders, Colonel General Romanchuk, who is allegedly commanding forces in Zaporizhia, previously wrote an article in Voennoye Misl about how to defend properly. This is likely deliberately put him in charge for many months to think through how to defend this thing in the south. And they thus far they're defending quite in a competent manner.
I think in the run-up to this offensive, folks like myself, Rob, too, were cautiously optimistic. I won't say we were particularly overly optimistic, but we're probably much more tend to be on the conservative end. At least I certainly tend to be more of a conservative analyst when it comes to expectations and what's like to happen. And the reason for that was frankly much less to do with Ukrainian forces and a lot more to do with the perception of the state of the Russian forces after the winter offensive. That said, we did not know what the axis of advance would be, what the Ukrainian plan would be. And so you would have had rather different outcomes, I personally think, if Ukrainian forces, let's say, pushed south from Vuhledar to where Russian naval infantry had been largely spent as a force during the winter, versus a mainline attack against the three main lines of Russian defenses south of Orikhiv, right, which is the shortest path to Melitopol, but also the one defended by 58th Army, which had been resting for months, digging in, and had allowed their forces in relatively good shape. So going into this, I think a lot of the views were that, yes, you can't predict what's going to happen. The Ukrainian military built out a new set of brigades, and we didn't know how they would perform. And also, they hadn't gone up against this type of Russian defense with this density of forces and these sort of entrenchments either. And my view had been, I think it's important to square back, even though if you've listened to this podcast, I'm sure you've heard this before, square the conversation that the reason why predictions are difficult to make in the space is that you think that you're watching the same war play out with the same two forces, but actually over the course of the year, the force quality changes dramatically. experienced units get attrition, they get rebuilt. They're new personnel, new commanders. The geometry of the battlefield is very different as well in this fight relative to Kherson. Kherson had much more favorable geometry for Ukrainian forces, and this battlefield does not. And you're in practice seeing two very different forces fighting in the summer of 2023 than you did in the summer of 2022, right? And we're going to talk next a bit about that and how that seems to have come together so far. And the last bit I'd say is that although it's true that the Russian military seems to be conserving artillery munitions, I think our impression from the front is that Ukraine enjoys a relative superiority in tube artillery, not a decisive superiority, but a relative one, whereas the Russian military still enjoys advantages in multiple launch rocket systems, and Ukraine probably has an advantage in quality of munitions, ability to use PGMs on the front, and long-range precision strike. But in general, I don't think it's fair to say that Ukraine enjoys the kind of superiority that would be decisive overall, and at the end of the day, it's delimited by the amount of munitions they have, which hinges on what they're able to receive from the United States and other countries. But okay, Rob, let me turn back over to you. Let's get into the conversation on what's happened in this offensive, or at least what we think has happened from the beginning.
The last point I'd make on that is just because the Russians are defending in a competent way, because we knew going offensive that Ukraine was not going to have some advantages that you'd want to have when you're attacking an entrenched defender, such as air superiority, a massive advantage artillery and other kind of fires. It was always going to be tough, and Ukraine really had to execute this in as close to flawlessly as possible to have that kind of success, to overcome the advantages of defending. And basically what we're talking about is that Ukraine made some mistakes early on that were quite costly, and particularly because the timing. Once you have some surprise, you need to really maximize that initial surprise. And Ukraine ran into some issues early on that led to some problems. So in the first week of June, when the counteroffensive began, we said before, there was a push around Bakhmut. There was fighting north and south of Bakhmut that continues Velika Novosilka and Orihov. One of the things we were looking for this offensive, we're looking for some of the new brigades, right? So Ukraine developed 9 new NATO-trained and equipped brigades. There are also some other brigades they formed as well, and the full picture is not fully clear. So I want to make that clear. We have some understanding of all the new brigades, but the complete status, the size, right? Not all of that is fully clear. So some of this has to be kind of tentative. But we knew some of these brigades, right? And one of the ones we knew was the 47th Mechanized Brigade. And that was one of the ones we were looking for because in order to determine when the counteroffensive was going to begin, we knew the 47th was receiving Bradleys. We knew it was a priority brigade. And so once that brigade started fighting, it gave us an indication of the importance of the Axis, importance of the actual counteroffensive beginning, and so on. And so in the Orihov Axis, right, the 47th Mechanized Brigade was committed at the beginning. Right, we all saw these photos of a number of Bradleys and other vehicles that were damaged and abandoned early on. In addition, the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, that's another new brigade, was also committed in the south. And there's some other brigades as well. So Ukraine has used a combination of these new brigades as well as some existing more experienced brigades in combination. And so the Orihov, there's also the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. There's a 65th Mechanized Brigade. There's likely some other units too. And in many cases, it appears Ukraine has kind of brought in battalions from other brigades as well. And then in Velika Novosilka, there's the 37th Marine Brigade. That's a new brigade that participated in the fighting with the AMX-10 these French armored vehicles. We also saw, I believe, the 31st and 23rd Brigades on that axis. I think those are new brigades, but didn't receive NATO equipment. That's my understanding. We also saw more existing brigades like the 68th Jaeger Brigade, 35th and 36th Marine Brigade, 128th TDF Brigade. All of those are taking part in the fighting. And it seems as though many of those experienced brigades were the ones that actually took a lot of these towns, right? And that axis, when Ukraine made gains down to Makarivka, it seems as though really the existing brigades are doing a lot of that fighting. I think that the 31st, 23rd, I think when the Rivnopil area took that area as well. And then there's some other brigades. There's the 21st is down in the south as well. And the National Guard is fighting too. So the National Guard's 15th Brigade is fighting right now, and there are other National Guard brigades as well. And there are a bunch of other assets, different UAV units, companies, other type of formations. Ukrainian Special Operations units are in the south. Some artillery brigades have been committed. So it's a variety of forces. So Ukraine's big bet and kind of risk over the last year was about forming these new brigades. And it was a bet that basically These brigades would be the main effort of this counteroffensive. In order to break through the Russian lines, they get new equipment, they train while the existing experienced brigades were holding the front line. And so over the winter, we know that Russia's winter offensive failed, and in many cases, they took very heavy losses. In some cases, right, the attrition ratio is not as favorable in Bakhmut and elsewhere. And in many of those places, some of Ukraine's best brigades were holding the front line. So, 93rd Mechanized Brigade, the 3rd Assault Brigade continues to fight around Bakhmut quite successfully. They were also holding the front line. A number of brigades were used to kind of hold Bakhmut and other parts up front. And so basically, they weren't able to be pulled off. They weren't able to kind of rest and refit to prepare for this counteroffensive the way you'd want them to. And the choice was, we're going to commit the experienced brigades to hold the front line and not give up in the front line in order to buy time so these new brigades could train this new equipment, and then they would play the kind of probably the decisive role in this counteroffensive. The issue is that the new brigades, their performance thus far has not lived up to the expectations. And it was always going to be difficult because these brigades were formed on short notice. They received new equipment, and new equipment has been very important. It's been very survivable. The Bradleys, in particular, has saved a lot of lives. But you had to have crews learn these vehicles in a very tight timeline, and then try to train together as a unit and combine arms training. And it was always going to be difficult to develop that. But because they formed units, it also required, developing unit cohesion is quite difficult, and it's a really kind of difficult and tangible to develop. You had new leaders, you had new people coming together, and an important part of this was that it wasn't just the infantry battalions that were new, it was the support capabilities too, right? So the artillery, engineers, other kind of support assets, these are all new formations. And so, they didn't have a ton of time to train together. And we saw in the beginning, the first couple of days of offensive, some of the kind of issues that the new brigades had that more experienced brigades likely would not have made. And so I'll go through a list of some of these. One of the overall issues was reconnaissance, right? Reconnaissance of the routes, reconnaissance for artillery, of finding the right targets. Also, I think for engineering lanes, there was an issue with adjacent unit coordination. Also, with the coordination in terms of the relief in place of the units they replaced, of knowing where necessarily mines were located, where the terrain features were located. One of the issues that happened in the first couple of days, a number of the units got disoriented, particularly at nighttime. Sometimes they moved the wrong direction. Sometimes they didn't follow behind lanes that were cleared of mines and actually ran into mines in other directions. In one case, one of the brigades, its advance was delayed by a couple hours. And instead of advancing on the objective at nighttime, they advanced at dawn, which negated the advantage in some of the new vehicles, NATO vehicles, and night vision capabilities. In addition, the artillery bombardment for that brigade, it didn't shift. So it occurred, and the advance happened a couple hours apparently after the bombardment was over, which meant all these Russian ATGM teams and the infantry forces were not being suppressed when the actual advance occurred. And one of the things we were told is that in some cases, mines did play a role, but most of the minefields were actually after the first line. And so in some of these cases, the initial advances were mostly stalled by ATGM fire, by helicopters, by other kind of assets in artillery fire, and not necessarily just the mines. I kind of think a general issue is that they often didn't have a plan B, or weren't able to seamlessly execute a plan B after they ran into kind of some of these foreseeable problems. And again, with more experienced brigades that have run through this, that have seen these kind of issues happen, they likely would have planned through some of these things. So again, these are some of the common issues. The problem was because the plan was to try and make a rapid breakthrough, and they had surprise initially when they made these mistakes, which again are not kind of shocking mistakes in many cases. The timing was very critical and really costly because then Russia could respond. They kind of learned where the main axis of advance would be, and they could adjust their defenses accordingly.
I want to backstop what Rob said here without disclosing specific details, without disclosing unit numbers or these types of specifics. I think it's somewhat clear to a number of folks how this came together, right? And I want to broaden the discussion a bit by saying that part of the challenge in expectations, what the expectations were, is that Ukraine throughout this war has shown that it's a very good defensive military. It's a military that's very effective in its pursuing defense in depth. On the offense, this military is not as well organized and is not as experienced at scaling offensive operations. So oftentimes it ends up being a platoon level or company level action. This offensive, while prosecuted by brigades, in practice what went forward were a series of reinforced companies or something like company tactical groups. So a battalion might deploy a company or maybe two companies forward and a third one behind them. And so these are company-sized elements. This is part of the reason why many may have mistaken the initial assault for just probing.
Thank you for listening to the special sneak preview of the Russia Contingency with Mike Kaufman. To listen to part 2, take advantage of our 10-year anniversary sale by clicking on the link right below in the show notes and get $10 off an annual membership. And if you're listening to this a little later, head on over to warontherocks.com/membership and sign up today.